Okay.
So welcome everyone. My name is Duncan Pritchard. I'm the director of the Centre for Knowledge, Technology and Society here at UC Irvine. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our second annual Epistemology of Education lecture. Our lecture this year will be given by Andrea English from the Moray School of Education at the University of Edinburgh. Andrea's done a lot of work on sort of Deweyan conceptions of education and how they play out in educational contexts. Her publications include, well, a monograph is the Discontinuity in Learning, Dewey, Herbart, and Education on Transformation, Cambridge University Press, 2013. And she's also edited a number of important works, including co-editor of John Dewey's Democracy in Education, a Centennial Handbook, Cambridge University Press, 2017. The History of Western Philosophy of Education, Volume 4, The Modern Era, which is Bloomsbury, 2021, which is the most recent edited work. And today she's going to talk to us about John Dewey, uncertainty, and non-affirmative democratic education. Andrea.
Okay, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I want to first thank Duncan Pritchard for inviting me to this special lecture, and also everyone for joining today, and UCI, of course. So let me share my screen. That would be a good idea. So, as was just mentioned, I'm going to be talking about Dewey uncertainty and non-affirmative democratic education. And the first thing I want to do actually is to have to pose a question to the audience, whoever you are out there, because I can't see you at the moment, but I will during the Q&A. And just ask you, what does it feel like to you? What images or experiences or words come to mind when you hear the word uncertainty? What does it feel like to be uncertain? So I just want to give you a moment to think about that. And also, if you want to put anything in the chat together with your other participants, you're welcome to do that. Or just keeping it into your own head. We won't, I wasn't going to ask you to speak out loud, but you can tell me during the Q&A. I just want you to hold that in your mind during the talk, and you'll figure out why in a moment. So hopefully everyone something has come to mind when you think about the word uncertainty. And that might be relevant to you as you start to hear about how I'm going to be talking about this. One image that I'll be bringing up now, but it will come again later in the talk, is how John Dewey talks about it. One of the ways he talks about uncertainty is like being on unsure footing. So for me, this image comes to mind, and maybe some of you have been in a hiking situation with a lot of unknowns. And so perhaps you can relate to this. So I'll come back to that. So when we ask ourselves, what is it like to be uncertain? It may conjure up feelings of anxiety or worry, and maybe that's what came up for you. Uncertainty can imply a calling into question or even an undoing of something we were certain about. As such, it can be coupled with a sense of unsettledness or feeling lost. Thus, in everyday life, uncertainty is sometimes something that we want to avoid. Yet in educational contexts, uncertainty can have educative value, and that's what I want to get to today. In this talk, I want to center uncertainty and indeterminacy as essential to the process of coming to know or learning. I'm going to show how John Dewey's understanding of the educational meaning of existential uncertainty lies at the heart of his idea of democratic education. Specifically, I'll argue that Dewey's theory of democratic education is grounded in a concept of transformative learning that necessarily involves experiences of existential uncertainty, and in a concept of teaching that necessarily involve supporting learners' opportunities to have educative experiences of existential uncertainty. In doing so, I aim to bring this democratic aspect of Dewey's notion of teaching into sharper relief by showing how it offers a productive extension of the tradition of non-affirmative educational theory. So I want to give a brief background for those who are unfamiliar with the tradition of non-affirmative educational theory. The lens of non-affirmative educational theory offers a way of differentiating affirmative from non-affirmative forms of teaching, and this goes to the work of Dietrich Benner. Accordingly, affirmative forms of teaching aim to educate the younger generation to affirm the existing order, or to affirm a future order as conceived of by the educators themselves. Non-affirmative forms of teaching aim to educate the younger generation towards the development of capacities to critically participate in an ongoing discussion of how the future should be shaped. Taking this definition further from a Deweyan perspective, I add that on my view, affirmative teaching predetermines individual and social problems for the next generation. Notably, this is what Dewey criticizes as traditional education, and this has the hallmarks of such affirmative teaching, as I will discuss later. On the other hand, non-affirmative teaching supports the next generation's critical reflective capacities to co-determine what counts as a problem, individual or social, in the first place. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the talk briefly. First, I'm going to be speaking about the idea of existential uncertainty and its relation to what Dewey calls an indeterminate situation, as a realm of learning that we find ourselves in prior to searching for and finding a problem, and thus logically prior to solving it. Secondly, I will discuss Dewey's notion of teaching within the context of his broader theory of democratic education. I focus on how the teacher is vital for cultivating learners' opportunities to make meaning from experiences of existential uncertainty, and discuss how this is associated with non-affirmative teaching. Thirdly, I build on and move beyond Dewey to formulate a notion of the teacher as a listener, and argue that this understanding of the teacher is vitally relevant for the theory and practice of democratic education as non-affirmative education. And yet it is in danger of being lost in the current climate of education today. Before I continue, I'd like to briefly share about my own history of coming to know non-affirmative educational theory as conceptualized by Dietrich Benner. I was first drawn to Benner's work on the education system of the former German Democratic Republic, and I had previously studied the GDR and the United States history education, and found that both national education systems adopted indoctrinating modes of teaching history. At the time, I did not realize I was already making conceptual distinctions along the lines of affirmative and non-affirmative educational theory. I was then in my studies at the Institute of Education at Humboldt University in Berlin, I was drawn to the work of Herbart, and this brought me to the overall sort of focus of what my work has been over the past several years, is that my purpose is to understand how is it possible to educate non-affirmatively, that is, in a way that nurtures the learner's capacity to learn and ensures that the integrity of the learner's being and humanity remains unharmed. So it is with this question that this paper and my broader work has been engaged. So we might think of Dewey, for those of you who know his work or have heard of him in just general discourse, We might think of Dewey as synonymous with problem-solving education. While Dewey recognized problems as important in learning, he takes issue with the idea that problems are the starting point of learning. This was at the heart of his well-known critique of traditional education. He was critical of traditional education, or what today can be referred to as transmissive teaching, because of how it provided learners with ready-made problems. Ready-made problems are those that are predefined problems formulated independently of the learner within the given learning situation. These are problems defined by the teacher or textbook with equally ready-made answers for memorization and recitation. So Dewey's interest lies in how we as human beings arrive at a problem in the first place. How we arrive at problems is meaningful if educators are to be able to refrain from imposing established problems onto learners as ones the learners should have, or worse, from presenting established problems as if they were the learner's own. So the question for Dewey, on my view, the critical question for understanding Dewey as in the tradition of non-affirmative teaching, is how do learners come to formulate their own problems? His answer reveals that learners' experiences of existential uncertainty can be understood as a necessary part of inciting the thinking that occurs on the path to searching for and finding problems. So I want to look more closely at what Dewey is criticizing, what forms of education or teaching he's criticizing. So answering this question, how do learners or human beings come to formulate their own problems? What does that process look like? Predetermined, learner-independent, ready-made problems of the sort Dewey criticized are part of a system of education that assumes that everything worthwhile is known, and thus a system that sees the job of the educator as passing on the known to learners. In this context, problems are what Dewey called problems for the learner as a pupil, that is, a student engaged in strategic forms of learning aimed at getting quickly to right answers, rather than for the learner as a human being. On this model, what is posed as a problem by the teacher is actually a completed thought in the guise of a problem, which learners are meant to passively consume. What Dewey points out in his critique of such forms of transmissive teaching is how it hinders the learner's capacity to think. Dewey argues that the prepackaged knowledge that is handed down from the teacher to the learner to be passively consumed can only be reproduced. Here, we can say that knowledge is the food that learners are meant to merely regurgitate. As such, knowledge and ideas do not genuinely affect the learner. They don't change how the learner thinks, feels, judges, acts, or makes meaning. The fact that the learner as a person remains unaffected by the ideas being handed down is only one reason why Dewey considers this traditional transmissive model problematic. There's also another reason, namely that in transmissive teaching, the finished ideas passed down to the learner fail to be affected by the learner. In other words, the individual learner's mind, her particular needs, questions, curiosities, prior experiences, ways of thinking, knowing, and doing have no impact on the ideas themselves. The learner as a particular human being does not matter to what is being learned. As a way of summarizing Dewey's twofold criticism, we can say that the learner has no generative power in transmissive learning situations. Just as the learner does not grow, so too the ideas as meanings and connections that are part of socially communicated understandings do not grow. And so another way of thinking about this, for those who are familiar with the tradition, or even if you're not, is thinking about the interactions between teacher and learner do not initiate the kinds of experiences that cultivate what Dewey calls growth, or using the German term we could refer to as Bildung, wherein self and world are in interplay and both transform on account of such interplay. So what we can think about as the central fallacy of this traditional or transmissive approach is its conception of the structure of learning. It places no educative value in theory or in practice on the human experience of limitation. Limit experiences, as I will call them here, refer to those moments in which we encounter something new or unexpected, such as a new idea or object, in a way that points to the fact that we may not yet know, we may not yet understand, we may not yet be able to do something. In other words, we experience a limit to our own established knowledge and ability. Dewey, in contrast, believes and places vital significance on the human experience of limitation as constituting the beginning of learning. To understand this, it's helpful to look at a couple of one of Dewey's recurring examples. So Dewey describes the case of an infant who cannot yet crawl, but who's trying to reach an object that is out of reach of her outstretched arm, but within her visual field. At the moment of trying to and yet not being able to grasp the object, the child undergoes an experience of limits of her existing knowledge and ability. In other words, she experiences what she cannot yet do. These limit experiences make us question what we have up to that point taken for granted as true, known, or part of what we're able to do. These moments can be called discontinuities in learning, breaks or interruptions in the smooth flow of experience, which will inform how we understand ourselves and the world around us, and thus how we make meaning. There are plenty of other examples if you think about potentially your own experiences, but also these are readily identifiable when observing young children freely exploring their surroundings. For example, from my own experience with my young daughter, who was just learning to stand, she saw a tablecloth corner hanging from the table, pulled herself up and tugged on the cloth corner, and then had a moment of hesitation as the plastic cups wobbled atop the table. She watched the cups until they settled with a face of wonder and perplexity. But as Dewey would tell us, these limit experiences are not just part of a child's experience of play, but they are just as much a part of an educated person or a scientist's new discoveries, for example, in a lab. Instead of skipping over this experience of limitation that human beings have through direct experiences with the world, in his educational theory, Dewey points how these experiences open up a realm of existential uncertainty that is educated. He delimits this realm of existential uncertainty using the term indeterminate situation. Looking back at the above examples, we can say that in each of the cases, the learner had an experience of her own limitation that placed her into an indeterminate situation, where she, even for a split second, was not sure what happened, not sure why the object could not be reached, and not sure why the cups wobbled. Dewey gets at the embodied existential feeling of such indeterminate situations. He writes, "The type of uncertainty we feel is not cognitive. Rather, it is precognitive or pre-reflective, like when we are on unsure footing. These moments involve our whole being, and thus they can be difficult, even painful to endure. Something is troublesome, but we do not know exactly what it is." Authors have described this in various ways as being a feeling of disquietude, an immediacy, a sort of awareness of difficulty, but an embodied awareness, not a cognitive recognition. or a sensing and a feeling of unsettlement, Dewey also speaks of indeterminate situations as disturbed situations, because our ordinary flow of experience has been disturbed in the sense of interrupted by the unexpected response from the world. In an indeterminate situation, we can think of it as being held in the muddy waters of experience, where things are not clear because we're not sure how we got into this situation, nor indeed how to get out of it. This is an experience that I have called an in-between realm of learning. In this in-between, our uncertainty is felt. We are disquieted, but we have not yet reflected and inquired into the source of our feeling of uncertainty. Drawing on the work of Kettemeyer-Drava, we can talk about these situations as spaces where the old is no longer trusted, but at the same time, the new is not yet understood. So if we think about common conceptions of learning that may tell us that learning is the takeaway of a process, the knowledge produced, and not the process itself, then situations as those described do not seem to be connected to learning at all. In fact, we might say they appear to be an absence of learning. Yet the state of existential uncertainty as a state of aporia that we find ourselves in within indeterminate situations has meaning for how we move forward. Thus, for Dewey, indeterminate situations, as those in which existential uncertainty emerges, are intimately tied to learning processes. Indeterminate situations are educative because they make us aware of where we are within our own learning process at any given time, by revealing what was, up to that point, in a certain sense, hidden. So for Dewey, the educative import of being in an indeterminate situation is that the existential uncertainty, that embodied feeling of being disturbed, initiates thinking. It arouses inquiry and incites reflection on the situation at hand. He underscores that although indeterminate situations are precognitive, because in them we have not yet begun to reflect on what happened to us, importantly, they are the necessary condition of cognitive operations or inquiry. For Dewey, the existential uncertainty within indeterminate situations arouses thinking as an expression of freedom. Moments of existential uncertainty that emerge from indeterminate situations cultivate the learner's freedom because they provide space for the learner's original response. Freedom, on this view, is understood as the individuality of the learner's thinking within, response to, and perspective on the troublesome, indeterminate situation. The individuality of each human being, each learner, becomes evident in how the learner responds to the situation with her own unique point of view or appeal of objects or mode of attack, as Dewey speaks of it. This individuality is about the peculiarity of the unforced response to the given situation. What Dewey says is equivalent to the originality of the learner's attitude and is not the originality of the result or the product. Indeterminate situations are situations that are unique to the learning being who is in interplay with the world. That is to say, they are indeterminate from the standpoint of the learner, even if the teacher knows exactly what is going on. So looking back at the two examples, it is that moment when the child wants to reach an object but is not able to, that a question can arise in her mind as to why she cannot reach it. On that basis, she can ask herself, what might I need in terms of resources? For example, other objects like a stick to nudge the reached for object towards me, or another person such as a parent to help me. These needs are not trivial. They point to precisely what the child in that moment needs to learn. Moreover, they point to an opening for the learner's imagination beyond what is towards what is possible. Though arriving in an indeterminate situation on its own is not the whole of learning, it marks an initial phase of what Dewey describes as a reflective experience. which is his term for vital transformative learning experiences. And I've written much about this, so I won't go into that term, but you're welcome to ask me questions about it. As the initial phase of learning, the indeterminate situation is critical as the source of freedom of thinking. It pushes the learner to, quote, think for herself, to think about her relation to the world, and to imagine possibilities for alternative conditions that could come into play to change that relation. As the source of freedom, the existential uncertainty emerging within the indeterminate situation is the source of a qualitatively different kind of problem than those ready-made problems handed down by a teacher in traditional education. It is the source of learner-dependent problems, which are problems for the learner as a human being. These problems that are formulated in response to indeterminate situations are those that take account of, rather than ignore, the world and others with which we are engaged. So with his description of indeterminate situations and the associated human experience of existential uncertainty, Dewey points to the significance of receptivity to difference as part of what it means to be human. The difference, strangeness, and newness that we encounter within our interactions with objects and other human beings can surprise us and make us wonder. To reflect on and formulate problems that take critical account for the difference we experience is to formulate a human problem, a problem for the learner as a human being. When we learn that the world and others affect how we think, judge, act, feel, and exist in the world, this is what we learn from being in those kinds of situations. For Dewey, such situations are at the heart of what fosters open-mindedness and intellectual growth. He writes, intellectual growth means constant expansion of horizons and consequent formation of new purposes and new responses. These are impossible without an active disposition to welcome points of view hitherto alien, an active desire to entertain considerations which modify existing purposes. Retention of capacity to grow is the reward of such intellectual hospitality. The worst thing about stubbornness of mind, about prejudices, is that they arrest development. They shut the mind off from new stimuli. Dewey's idea of the indeterminate situation locates an educative space of human thinking as the exploration of newness, difference, and otherness that arises via what we can call a non-affirmative beginning of learning. Such a beginning is not imposed or forced onto the learner by a question with a predetermined answer from an external authority in the guise of an educator. Rather, it is a beginning that is initiated within and in light of the learner's particular way of interacting with the world and others, that is, within the learner's process of Bildung. So we might think that such a process could happen on its own, and that as I have discussed, if this is part of human nature, how we think about human learning, then perhaps we might think that we don't need educators. But in fact, quite the opposite is true if we think about Dewey's ideas. For Dewey, the educator is not one who passes on prepackaged knowledge for learners to unquestioningly consume, but one who provides the conditions for learners' interactions with the world that expand their meaning horizons, as I discuss next. So what is the role of the educator, and why do we need educators? Dewey's insights help to identify that in traditional transmissive education, a specific hierarchical relationship is implied between the older and younger generation. The older generation has done the hard work of thinking, problem finding, problem solving, and learning, and has established certainties for the younger generation to unquestioningly accept, that is, to affirm as true. However, Dewey was also critical of forms of education that claim to be progressive, yet understand learning to occur by just doing, and in turn, understand teaching as allowing learners activity for its own sake. Here, the learner is the sole determinant of the educational situation, and as a consequence, the teacher does not have the role of a supporting learner reflection on the existential uncertainty emerging from what was done and undergone. As such, this reductive mode of teaching is actually a release from pedagogical responsibility. As philosophers Rousseau and Herbart have pointed out in different ways, such contexts do not avoid hierarchical relationships between generations. They only establish a different one, namely one wherein the younger generation rules over the older. So looking at these two models of education, we can say that each model fails to make existential uncertainty meaningful for the learner's learning process. On the transmission model, it is not the role of the teacher to value the learner's existential uncertainty, and hence it is not taken up by the teacher. This does not mean that in transmissive classrooms, learners do not experience existential uncertainty when they arrive at the limits of their own knowledge or ability. Naturally, they do. And most of us, anyone who's listening today, have experienced this kind of teacher in their own upbringing, as it is still today very common. And so naturally, we can think we do arrive at the limits of our own knowledge and ability in such contexts. However, so we could imagine, for example, a learner may feel deeply unsettled by the term half when it gets repeatedly used by a teacher and peers in a math lesson, because she does not understand the meaning of the word and thus cannot follow the lesson. Or a learner may feel a nausea-like unease of not knowing how to pronounce a particular word when trying to read aloud in front of the class. In contrast, in reductive models of progressive teaching, the teacher may initiate learners' direct interactions with objects and peers in the classroom learning environment that incite unsettledness or unease. However, the teacher here does not see it as her role to support learners' reflection on such feelings of uncertainty. Thus, she may miss opportunities to support learners to draw meaning from the limited experiences that were the source of such uncertainty. Neither of these models foster an environment that support existential uncertainty as an opportunity for thinking and growth. Thus, these classrooms leave it to chance as to whether the learner will face the discomfort or even fear arising from existential uncertainty as a site for transformative learning, or whether instead he or she will decide to overlook or ignore it and retreat to situations of comfort without growth. Today, just as in Dewey's time, both transmissive and reductive both transmissive and reductive progressive models of teaching pose critical threats to democratic education as a form of non-affirmative education. Dewey points out that at the heart of the problem with these models is that they each, in their own way, gravely misunderstand the principles of freedom and authority in education. In transmissive, affirmative teaching, the teacher falsely assumes that an idea can be conveyed as an idea directly from teacher to learner for learners to passively receive. Thus, transmissive teaching has no need to cultivate experiential processes in which learners are wrestling with the conditions of a problem firsthand, as Dewey puts it, in ways that incite critical reflective thinking. Instead, such experiences would be considered counterproductive to learning. In other words, the transmissive teacher does not see it as her role to support learners' productive struggle, as I refer to it elsewhere. On such a transmissive model, the teacher's assumed authority over knowledge is translated in practice as authority over persons. Authority manifests as external control of learners' movement, such that discipline, or what we today might call classroom management, is considered an essential means for social control of learners. The classroom is thus designed to enforce control of bodies as a means of controlling minds. Learners sit in rows of desks for passive listening and conform to a single mold of method of study and recitation, an image that Dewey calls to mind in his book, School and Society. Dewey's considerations invite us to ask what happens in such transmissive environments to thinking of the sort that is an expression of freedom, of individuality. His answer is that thinking is not merely hindered, but gradually destroyed. The learner's confidence in his own quality of mental operation is undermined, and a docile subjection to the opinion of others is inculcated, or else ideas run wild, end quote. What is cultivated is a form of parasitic dependence of one mind on another, namely the learner's dependence on the educators as representatives of the existing order. The result of such teacher-learner interaction is intellectual servility, the form of mental life antithetical to democracy. On the other hand, if we look at what I've been calling reductive, progressive forms of teaching, these understand freedom as a release from all external authority. They leave the learner at bay. This manifests in classrooms as merely freedom of movement. What is unattended to by the teacher is genuine freedom, the individuality of learners' responses that need to be supported by the teacher in order for lived experiences of uncertainty to become a source of active reflection. In failing to reflect on uncertainty, learners do not learn to detach themselves from their self-interested motivations for doing something in the world, for example, for grabbing an object. Hence, in such reductive progressive models, the learner does not learn to reflectively take in the response from the world. She does not learn receptivity to difference, taking it in as valuable to further considerations of what can or should be done in a given situation. Instead, the learner may develop what is, as Dewey points out, a dangerous form of independence. Dewey warns that too strong a sense of personal independence often makes an individual so insensitive in his relation to others as to develop an illusion of being able to stand and act alone, and what he calls, quote, an unnamed form of insanity, which is responsible for a large part of the remedial suffering of the world, end quote. Such insanity, characterizing the narcissism of dictators, is seen today in the leadership of countries that still claim to be democratic. So what does teaching look like that recognizes and values freedom? One indispensable aspect of this that I argue is at the heart of Dewey's unique contribution to the tradition of non-affirmative teaching is that teaching must create opportunities for learners to land in indeterminate situations and experience existential uncertainty. Dewey was well aware that there is an inherent danger with any practice of teaching that proposes to initiate learner uncertainty, especially of the existential sort he describes. There is a risk of overwhelming the learner and thus leading them to disengage with the learning situation. He writes, not all difficulties call out thinking. Sometimes they overwhelm and submerge and discourage. Teachers must deeply understand in theory and be able to assess in practice the differences between the types of situations and existential experiences of limits that are productive and those that are destructive, as I've referred to this distinction elsewhere. To truly nourish the mind-body complex, Dewey talks about the teacher as an artist. Teachers must offer opportunities for learners to think thinking that is genuinely tied to learners' limit experiences and the existential uncertainty that emerges. To do this, a different notion of the teacher must be embraced. The teacher as an artist is one who creates the conditions that will enable each learner to make his or her own special contribution to a group interest. This is a dramatically different vision of who the teacher is than that of transmissive affirmative education. Dewey uses metaphors of food and nourishment to illustrate this contrast. In transmissive teaching, the teacher is merely a cook who implements other people's recipes with the aim of mechanical precision. The teacher as artist, however, is like the chef who designs the recipes for the cookbook. As an artist, we could say, they take up the food, that is, the new ideas that arise from their lived experiences with learners in classrooms, to creatively modify the recipe according to what the learners bring to the educational situation. These new ideas, this new food from learners is produced when learners are given opportunities to engage in situations in which they can demonstrate intellectual initiative, independence in observation, judicious invention, and foresight of consequences. In this way, they are given opportunities for freedom, for individuality, the personal contribution to their own learning. Rather than leading to docile dependence or radical independence, such opportunities can lead to learners' development of interdependence, of vibrating sympathetically with the attitudes and doings of those about them. Such teaching involves a skilled improvisational ability to be receptive to and respond to the learner's demands from the environment. And this idea of teaching goes back to Herbart's notion of pedagogical tact, which draws on Aristotle's concept of phronesis and applies it to the concept of the educator. So if we think about teachers today, if they are truly to be receptive to this freshness and newness that each learner brings, they must be prepared to experience their own discontinuities in teaching. That is, they must be prepared to arrive in indeterminate situations and experience existential uncertainty, as these are situations that signal teachers that they need to reflect and assess if they are adequately responding to the learner. Dewey writes, in this context, the teacher becomes an intellectual companion to learners. This role is one wherein the teacher has consciously chosen to be a co-participant in the making of the educational situation as a necessary condition for each learner to become a co-participant in its making. As a co-participant, the learner's voice emerges not as one that submits to existing learning situations, but as one that generates new learning situations based in vital experiences of indeterminacy that allow her to discover what she needs to learn and know. So I want to move to this idea of teacher as listener, which builds on and draws and takes Dewey's thinking further. Common understandings of teaching still rely on the idea that the teacher is someone who tells. Reading Dewey through the lens of the critical tradition of non-affirmative educational theory helps draw out what is implied by Dewey's theory of democratic teaching and yet goes beyond what Dewey himself articulated. Namely, this lens helps reframe the teacher as one who listens. On this view, non-affirmative teaching is fundamentally relational and receptive, though not passive. It is receptive to the experiences of learners, the genuine existential and reflective needs and questions that emerge from their limit experiences, and the genuine human problems that are generated by learners, not by teachers' textbooks or the system. As an intellectual companion, the teacher is one who actively creates opportunities to listen to learners' ways of thinking knowing, and being. Transmissive affirmative teaching as telling is still pervasive today, not just in schools, but also in tertiary education. Educational policies support this affirmative mode when they are grounded in views of high quality education that equate quality with that which is quantitatively measurable, and in turn construct teacher accountability on the basis of student achievement on standardized tests. It is not merely that such policies do not account for what is educative about in any given situation designed for learning and thinking, but rather it is that they actually suppress it. These policies serve to direct teachers' attention away from students' learning processes involving genuine individuality and towards uniformity of thinking, represented in standardized outcomes measured on assessments. They create environments in schools and communities where teachers are expected to close their eyes and shut their ears to learners' expression of uncertainty, confusion, doubt, frustration, and the like. They foster deficit views of certain learners who do not conform, who cannot or do not want to reproduce pre-digested facts and figures, labeling them as those who do not measure up. But it is not only the learner's thinking that is shut down in such systems, it is also the teacher's, as she or he is not provided the space for the originality of response that is needed to respect learners' expressed needs. One significant loss as a society that we endure and are enduring through affirmative systems of education is the loss of the teacher as a listener, as one who listens deeply to and for the learner's uncertainty and struggle, thinking, generative ideas, emotional needs, that is, one who listens to and for the learner's whole being. Instead, we get the teacher as a kind of mechanical listener, as if a machine programmed to listen evaluatively, as Brent Davis calls it, to whether students have right answers. This kind of mechanical listening reinforces what Fritz Ozer and Maria Speichiger call the Bermuda Triangle of classroom interaction, whereby the teacher asks a question. One student gives a wrong answer. The teacher moves to the next student who gives the correct answer, after which the teacher moves on. They note that in such interactions, no one actually learns because the student who knew still knows, and the one who did not know does not understand why her answer was wrong. In these situations, the teacher does not learn about her students' ways of thinking and being. She does not gather any new food for thought from students to take forward in new creative educational situations. Detrimentally, the teacher as teller and the student as passive listener mutually reinforce and perpetuate one another. The teacher does not listen openly, but rather filters out anything new and fresh. And the students do not speak unless they have the right answer, and thus do not make known what is new and fresh in their minds. The individuality of both student and teacher is suppressed. It has been recognized that the lack of genuine, open listening is contributing to the crisis in democracy. To avert this crisis, teachers, scholars, and citizens that intend to foster non-affirmative democratic education must deeply consider how such listening is learned. I contend that when teachers genuinely listen to learners' full experiences, including their uncertainty and struggle, learners also learn to listen, but not as an act of obedience, but rather as an act of expressing the genuine desire to learn from their own uncertainty arising from that which they encounter as different and new. Such pedagogical listening, as my colleagues and I have discussed it, to and with learners is an intentional act of recognition of the learner as a human being, in that it offers the learner the possibility to actualize the right to discover individuality, to discover freedom, to discover self and one's needs, including the deep need for others. In other words, the learner is given the possibility to discover what it means to be human. Thus, teacher listening is essential to democratic education as non-affirmative education, that is, education which is not understood as enculturation and socialization into citizenship of a democracy as a preformed, learner-independent political system, but rather is understood as a means of fostering democracy as what Dewey calls a way of life. Democracy, understood as a way of life, is a disposition towards reflection and growth through exchanges with human beings who have the option of seeing the world otherwise. Given the vital role of existential experience in learning as inciting, thinking, and initiating the formulation of genuine learner-dependent problems, it cannot be left to chance whether learners have opportunities to have such educative experiences of existential uncertainty. The experience of existential uncertainty is the moment where learners begin to sense and feel a sense of possibilities that are unrealized and that might be realized. Creating indeterminate situations and listening genuinely to learners' needs that emerge can be a force for constructive social change. If these possibilities are put in contrast, as Dewey writes, with actual conditions, then this is the most penetrating criticism of the latter that can be made. It is by a sense of possibilities opening up before us that we become aware of the constrictions that hem us and of burdens that oppress. Many philosophers of education today, following Dewey and others in the critical pedagogy tradition, still envision classrooms as spaces where a sense of imagination and possibility can be cultivated. Classrooms can be spaces for cultivating what Bell Hooks refers to as radical openness, or what Maxine Greene calls moral wide awakeness, or what Leonard Wax calls apophatic listening, a deeply open empathic listening. As we move further into the 21st century, it is urgent that we answer the call to rehumanize what have been dehumanizing spaces of schools that have marginalized and silenced so many voices. To do this, I suggest that a critical question we need to ask is, how do teachers gain agency in systems that are telling them to view students as data points, as numbers, and not as human beings? Dewey's insights, and more broadly, the lens of critical non-affirmative educational theory, suggests that one starting point for teachers may be to identify just how, in the life of each classroom, the seed for situations of genuine indeterminacy can be planted and nourished. Thank you for listening. And just to note that this talk will appear as a chapter in the book Non-Affirmative Theory of Education and Bildung, which is forthcoming this year. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, Andrea. That was an incredibly rich talk. Fascinating. Okay, so what we'll do is people could either put their hands up or put their question in the Q&A, and then I'll bring people in to the chat. And while that's happening, I'll ask a question so people have got time to put some questions in there. Yeah, so I just have I've always found this idea, it sounds right to me. There's a kind of phenomenology, as you call this, existential uncertainty, which drives the